Jake Hart was a long-haul trucker. For 10 years, he'd driven his 18-wheeler across the country, delivering goods to every corner of the map. He loved the open road, the quiet nights, and the hum of his truck's engine. But there was one rule Jake always followed: never take Route 65 through Black Hollow after sunset. Truckers swapped stories about Black Hollow at diners and gas stations. Some said the road was cursed. Others claimed they'd seen strange lights or figures standing in the middle of the highway. Jake never believed in ghosts or curses, but he'd heard enough to avoid the place. One rainy October night, Jake was running late. His delivery was scheduled for 8 a.m., and the storm had slowed him down. He checked his map. Route 65 was the fastest way to make up lost time. "Come on, Jake," he muttered to himself. "You don't believe in that junk. It's just a road." With a deep breath, he turned his truck toward Black Hollow. The rain poured harder as Jake entered the stretch of Route 65 that cut through the dense woods. The road was narrow, with sharp curves, and the thick trees on either side seemed to lean toward the highway. His headlights barely pierced the darkness. The only sounds were the patter of rain on the windshield and the steady rumble of his engine. He switched on the radio to drown out the silence, but all he got was static. Jake frowned and fiddled with the dial, but every station was the same: white noise. He turned it off with a sigh. About 20 minutes into the drive, Jake saw something strange ahead. A figure was standing on the side of the road, drenched in the rain. As he got closer, he could see it was a woman in a long white dress. Her hair was soaked, and she didn't move as his truck approached. Jake slowed down, unsure of what to do. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't his thing, but leaving someone stranded in the middle of nowhere didn't feel right either. He pulled over and rolled down the passenger window. "Hey," he called out. "You okay? Need a ride?" The woman turned slowly to face him. Her face was pale, and her eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Thank you," she said in a soft, almost whispery voice. She climbed into the passenger seat without waiting for an invitation. Jake cleared his throat. "Where are you headed?" She didn't answer right away. She stared straight ahead, her hands resting neatly in her lap. Finally, she said, "Just drive. I'll tell you when to stop." Jake didn't like this. The woman's presence felt off. Her dress was dry now, even though she'd been soaked just moments before, and the air inside the cab had grown cold, making Jake shiver despite the heater being on. He glanced at her again. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she was listening to something he couldn't hear. Jake decided to break the silence. "So, what's your name?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She turned to him, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "Emily," she said. Jake nodded, forcing a smile. "Nice to meet you, Emily. I'm Jake." She didn't respond. The silence grew heavier. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and he found himself wishing he'd taken the longer route. As they drove deeper into Black Hollow, Jake noticed the road looked different. The pavement was cracked, and the paint lines were faded. The trees seemed to crowd closer, their gnarled branches stretching toward the truck like skeletal hands. And then the radio turned on by itself. Static filled the cab, followed by faint whispers. Jake's heart raced as he reached to turn it off, but the dial wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they sounded like screams. "Turn it off!" Jake shouted. "It's too late," Emily said, her voice unnervingly calm. Suddenly, the truck's headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. Jake slammed on the brakes as the truck skidded to a stop in the middle of the road. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, and Jake's breathing grew rapid. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice trembling. Emily turned to him, her expression unreadable. "They're here." "Who's here?" Jake demanded. Before she could answer, the truck shook violently, as if something massive had hit it. Jake grabbed his flashlight and opened the door, stepping into the cold, wet night. The rain had stopped, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. He shone the flashlight around, but the beam barely cut through the thick fog that had suddenly appeared. "Emily?" he called, turning back toward the truck. but the cab was empty. The passenger door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Jake's heart pounded as he scanned the area. That's when he saw them. Figures emerging from the fog, their shapes barely human. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking and twisting as if they were puppets on strings. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, just like Emily's. Jake stumbled back toward the truck, but the figures were closing in. He climbed into the cab and slammed the door, locking it. His hands shook as he tried to start the engine. Come on, he muttered. The engine roared to life, and Jake hit the gas. The truck lurched forward, and he sped down the road, not caring about the sharp turns or the fog. The figures didn't give chase, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He glanced at the passenger seat. It was empty. He let out a shaky breath. Just get out of Black Hollow, he told himself. You'll be fine. The road stretched on endlessly, and Jake realized with growing panic that the scenery wasn't changing. The same twisted trees, the same cracked pavement. It was as if he were driving in a loop, and then he saw her. Emily was standing in the middle of the road, her dress glowing faintly in the darkness. Jake slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. He jumped out, his fear replaced by anger. What do you want from me? He shouted. Emily tilted her head, her glowing eyes meeting his. You shouldn't have come here, she said. Her voice echoed unnaturally, as if a dozen others were speaking with her. The fog thickened, and the figures appeared again surrounding Jake. He backed toward the truck, but this time the figures didn't stop. They closed in, their hollow eyes staring through him. As the first one reached him, Jake felt a cold hand grip his arm. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fog. The next morning, a passing trucker found Jake's rig parked on the side of Route 65. The cab was empty, the engine cold. They never found Jake. To this day, truckers warn each other about Black Hollow. Some say they've seen the ghost of a trucker wandering the woods, his flashlight flickering in the dark. Others claim to have heard his voice on the radio, whispering one word: run. Weeks turned into months, but Jake Hart's disappearance remained a mystery. His family put out flyers, police searched the area, and truckers across the country passed along stories of a trucker gone missing on Route 65. But no one dared to linger long enough in Black Hollow to find answers. Then one night, another trucker named Dan Foster found himself running late. Dan was a seasoned driver with a reputation for bravery or recklessness, depending on who you asked. When he heard about Jake's story, he scoffed. Ghosts don't scare me, he told anyone who'd listen. Jake probably ran off to start a new life. Happens all the time. It was on a chilly December night, under a full moon, that Dan found himself looking at the Route 65 sign. He hesitated for only a moment before shrugging. I've driven worse roads, he muttered, turning onto the cursed highway. The first few miles were uneventful. The road was as eerie as the stories described, narrow, cracked, and surrounded by dense trees. The radio played a country song, and Dan tapped his fingers on the wheel, trying to shake the uneasy feeling settling over him. And then, just like Jake, Dan saw the figure. A woman stood on the side of the road, her white dress fluttering in the windless night. Her pale face was tilted downward, her hair hiding her features. Dan slowed down, curiosity overriding his common sense. You're just a person, he muttered, pulling over. He rolled down the passenger window. Hey, you lost? The woman lifted her head, revealing glowing eyes that sent a shiver down Dan's spine. She said nothing, only stared at him. Dan wasn't one to scare easily. Well, I don't have all night, he said gruffly. Need a lift or not? Without a word, she climbed into the truck. Dan drove in silence, glancing at his passenger every so often. Unlike Jake, he was more annoyed than scared. So, what's your name? She turned her head slightly. Emily. Dan nodded, though his grip on the wheel tightened. Emily, huh? People been talking about you, creeping out truckers and whatnot. What's your story? You should turn back, she said softly. Dan chuckled nervously. Yeah, not gonna happen. Got a schedule to keep. Emily's gaze moved toward the radio, which crackled before shifting to static. A voice came through, faint but unmistakable. "Dan, run." He froze. The voice was Jake's. The truck shuddered violently, pulling Dan's attention back to the road. Fog rolled in from nowhere, thick and impenetrable, and the trees seemed to move, their branches twisting unnaturally. "What in the hell?" Dan muttered, jerking the wheel to avoid a shadowy figure that darted across the road. "You can't escape," Emily whispered. Dan slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt. He turned to Emily, anger and fear mixing in his expression. "What's going on? What did you do?" But Emily was gone. The air outside was deathly still as Dan stepped out of the cab, flashlight in hand. His boots crunched on the cracked pavement. The fog seemed alive, swirling around him in an almost deliberate way. "Jake!" he called, his voice echoing into the void. A faint light flickered in the distance. Dan hesitated, then followed it, moving deeper into the forest that bordered the road. The light swayed, leading him through the twisted trees. It wasn't until he reached a clearing that Dan realized where the light had come from. It was a flashlight, lying on the ground. It flickered weakly, and next to it was a trucker's cap. Dan picked it up, his heart sinking as he recognized the name stitched into the brim. Jake. A cold wind blew through the clearing, and Dan turned to see the figures Jake had described. They emerged from the fog, dozens of them, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. Dan backed away, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "Stay back!" he shouted. The figures didn't stop. As the circle tightened around him, Dan noticed one figure standing apart from the others, a man in a trucker's jacket, his face pale and his eyes glowing. "Jake?" Dan whispered. Jake's expression was sorrowful as he stepped forward. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice echoing strangely. I just wanted to see if the stories were true," Dan stammered. Jake shook his head. "Now you're part of them, like me." Before Dan could respond, the figures reached him. Cold hands gripped his arms, his legs, pulling him into the fog. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the endless void. The next day, Dan's truck was found abandoned on Route 65, its cab empty. Word of his disappearance spread quickly among truckers. Some say his voice joins Jake's in the whispers on the radio. Others claim they've seen two figures standing in the woods, Jake and Dan, their glowing eyes watching the road, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to take the cursed route. And so, the warnings continue. Never take Route 65 after dark. Never stop for hitchhikers in Black Hollow. Because once you're there, there's no turning back. The eerie legend of Route 65 grew as the years passed, spreading to truck stops, diners, and even small-town newspapers. New drivers were warned by the veterans, stay away from Black Hollow, especially after dark. But not everyone heeds a warning. One summer evening, a young trucker named Eddie Barnes sat in a diner along Interstate 72. Fresh out of training and eager to make a name for himself, Eddie didn't care much for ghost stories or old superstitions. "Ghosts ain't real," Eddie told the older truckers. He laughed as they swapped tales of strange sightings and cursed highways. When someone mentioned Route 65, his ears perked up. "Why does everyone talk about this place like it's haunted?" Eddie asked, smirking. An older trucker named Pete leaned back in his chair, his face serious. "Because it is. Everyone who's gone through there has either vanished or come out. Changed." "Changed?" Eddie scoffed. "Come on, y'all just telling tall tales to scare the rookie." Pete narrowed his eyes. "You think this is a joke, kid? Take the route, and you'll see for yourself. But don't say we didn't warn you." Eddie grinned. Challenge accepted. The night Eddie entered Black Hollow was calm, the moon full and bright. He glanced at the Route 65 sign as his rig turned onto the narrow road. He felt a small twinge of unease, but he brushed it off. "It's just another stretch of asphalt," he muttered. Miles ticked by, and Eddie started to notice how quiet it was. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of his engine and the wheels on the road. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees overhead, casting long, shifting shadows. Then the radio cut out. Static filled the cab, followed by faint whispers. Eddie frowned and tapped the radio. "Cheap piece of junk," he grumbled. But then the whispers grew louder. Eddie, his hands tightened on the wheel. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaky. The whispers stopped abruptly. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then, out of nowhere, the figure appeared. A woman in a white dress, standing motionless on the shoulder of the road. Eddie slammed on the brakes, his truck screeching to a stop. Heart pounding, he leaned out of the window. "Hey, you okay?" The woman didn't respond. Eddie sighed. "All right, let's see what's going on." He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cab. "Ma'am?" he called, walking toward her. His boots crunched on the cracked pavement. As he got closer, he realized she wasn't wet or dirty. Even though the road was damp, her hair was too still, despite the faint breeze. Something was wrong. "Maybe I should just go," Eddie muttered, taking a step back. The woman suddenly turned her head toward him, her glowing eyes locking onto his. Eddie froze. His legs refused to move as the air around him grew freezing cold. Why did you come here?" she asked, her voice echoing unnaturally. Eddie's throat was dry, but he managed to whisper, I didn't know. It's too late now," she said. The fog rolled in, thick and heavy, swallowing the road and the truck. Shapes began to move in the shadows, figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. Eddie stumbled backward, tripping over a crack in the road. He hit the ground hard, his flashlight skidding away. When he looked up, the figures were closing in. One of them stepped forward, and Eddie's breath caught in his throat. It was a man in a trucker's jacket, his pale face and glowing eyes unmistakable. "Jake Hart," Eddie whispered. Eddie scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. "Stay back, all of you," he shouted, but his voice quivered with fear. Jake raised a hand, his expression sorrowful. "You shouldn't have come, Eddie." Eddie shook his head, his fear turning into desperation. "I'll leave. I'll get out of here right now." "You can't," Jake said. Suddenly, cold hands gripped Eddie's arms. He screamed as the figures pulled him into the fog. The last thing he saw was the woman's glowing eyes, watching him silently. The next morning, Eddie's truck was found abandoned on Route 65, just like Jake's and Dan's before him. His wallet and keys were still in the cab, but there was no sign of Eddie himself. The veteran truckers shook their heads when the news reached them. "Another one lost," Pete muttered. But something changed after Eddie's disappearance. Truckers who drove near Route 65 began reporting new phenomena. Some heard Eddie's voice over the radio, pleading for help. Others claimed to see his flashlight flickering deep in the woods. A few even saw his face among the glowing-eyed figures that lingered on the edges of the fog. The warning about Route 65 became even clearer. If you go into Black Hollow, you don't come out the same, or at all. Black Hollow's legend lives on, with truckers still whispering stories at every stop along the highway. And while some dismiss them as superstitions, those who've dared to venture onto Route 65 after dark have learned the truth the hard way. They became part of the legend themselves. Months passed after Eddie's disappearance, and Route 65 gained even more infamy among the trucking community. Yet, a few curious drivers had tried crossing the route during the day, swearing it was just a regular road in daylight hours. Nothing unusual happened when the sun was out. But for all the stories of disappearances, whispers on radios, and glowing eyes in the fog, a strange pattern started to emerge. Some drivers survived Black Hollow. These weren't drivers with bravado or who ignored the warnings like Eddie. They were seasoned truckers, wise enough to avoid the road, but who, through unfortunate circumstances, delays, accidents, or detours, had found themselves on Route 65 after sunset. One such survivor was Martin Clay. Unlike Jake, Dan, or Eddie, Martin made it out alive. But Martin never wanted to talk about what happened there. When anyone brought it up, he'd only say, "I followed the rules." No one knew what rules he meant. That is, until one night when another veteran trucker named Carla Jacobs cornered him at a truck stop diner. Carla had spent 20 years on the road, and she'd heard the stories, but unlike others, she wasn't content to let the mystery of Black Hollow remain unsolved. She wanted answers. "Martin," Carla said, sliding into the booth across from him. "I know what happened to Jake, Dan, and Eddie, but I also know you made it out. Tell me why." Martin frowned, his hands wrapped tightly around his coffee mug. "Drop it, Carla." "I can't," she said firmly. "We have to warn people. If there's a way to survive that place, people need to know." Martin sighed and glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "You want to survive Black Hollow? Fine. I'll tell you. But you better remember every word I say." Carla leaned in, her heart racing. Martin lowered his voice. "You ever find yourself on Route 65 at night, this is what you do. Don't stop for anyone. Not a woman in a white dress, not a child crying, not even another trucker. Whatever you think you see out there isn't real, or at least not alive. Ignore the radio. They'll try to mess with your head. Static, voices, maybe even someone you know calling your name. Don't listen to it. Keep your eyes on the road. It doesn't matter what you see in the mirrors or on the sides of the highway. If you look too long, they'll pull you in. Never get out of the truck. No matter what happens, engine trouble, lights flickering, or something banging on the cab, stay inside and keep driving. If you see the fog, it's already started. That's when you need to floor it and pray." Black Hollow doesn't let people go easily. Carla blinked, her mouth dry. "That's it? Just keep driving and don't stop?" Martin nodded grimly. "That's what I did. I stayed in my lane, kept my eyes ahead, and didn't let them get in my head." "And what happens if you mess up?" Carla asked. Martin's face darkened. "Then you're part of the road. Forever." Carla didn't think she'd ever have to put Martin's rules to the test. She had planned her routes carefully to avoid Route 65, but one fateful night, a detour caused by a massive wreck forced her onto the cursed highway. As she turned onto Route 65, her chest tightened. The clock on her dashboard read 11:46 p.m. "Stay calm," she told herself, gripping the wheel tightly. "Follow the rules." The first mile passed without incident, but then the radio crackled. A familiar voice came through, faint but distinct. "Carla, help Mum." She froze. It was her sister's voice, clear as day. "Don't listen," she whispered, forcing her eyes on the road. She reached over and turned the radio off, but the voice continued, growing louder. "Carla, don't leave me." Her breathing grew ragged. Tears stung her eyes, but she gritted her teeth and kept driving. The fog came next, thick and unnatural. It rose from the ground like smoke, surrounding her truck. Her headlights dimmed, barely illuminating the road ahead. Shapes moved in the fog, shadows that flickered and darted just out of sight. Carla's hands trembled on the wheel. "Don't look," she muttered, repeating Martin's advice like a mantra. Something banged on the passenger side door. Bam, bam, bam! She jumped, her heart pounding. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure clinging to the side of her truck. A pale, grinning face pressed against the glass. "Let me in," it whispered, its lips not moving. Carla screamed but didn't stop. The fog grew denser, and the truck shuddered as though invisible hands were clawing at it. The engine sputtered, but Carla pressed the gas pedal to the floor. Through the haze, she saw something ahead, a woman in white standing in the center of the road. Her glowing eyes locked onto Carla's. "Don't stop," Carla hissed to herself. "Keep going." The woman didn't move, and Carla braced herself for impact. But as her truck barreled toward the figure, the fog lifted, and the woman vanished. The highway stretched out before her, normal again. When Carla finally reached the end of Route 65, she pulled over and collapsed against the steering wheel, her whole body shaking. She had made it. The rules had saved her, but Carla knew one thing for sure: she would never, ever test Black Hollow again. And she would spend the rest of her life warning others to do the same. Tom Davis had been driving trucks for nearly 20 years. He knew every highway like the back of his hand, every truck stop diner, and every stretch of lonely, empty road. But even with all his experience, there were some things he couldn't explain. Some roads that left him uneasy, stories that other truckers whispered late at night. One fall evening, Tom got a job hauling steel pipes from Denver to a small town in Arizona. The route was long, and most of it cut through desolate desert highways. Tom was used to the silence of these roads. They stretched for miles with nothing but the occasional cactus or abandoned gas station. He liked the solitude. It gave him time to think. Before leaving the truck yard, a fellow driver named Bill patted him on the shoulder. "Watch out for Highway 77, Bill said with a serious look. Tom chuckled. "You mean that ghost story everyone's talking about? Come on, Bill. I've driven that road a dozen times." "I'm not joking, Tom," Bill said, his voice low. "Last month, a driver disappeared on that highway. His truck was found, but he wasn't. No signs of an accident, no blood, nothing. Just gone." Tom laughed it off. "Probably a drunk driver who wandered off." Bill shook his head. "That highway's different, Tom. Just be careful." The night started off fine. Tom's 18-wheeler rumbled down the highway, headlights piercing the darkness. The hum of the engine and the sound of the tires against the asphalt were like music to him. Around 10 p.m., he reached the stretch of Highway 77. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the desert. It was quiet, too quiet. Not another car or truck in sight. Even the radio seemed to struggle, fading in and out with static. "Just another lonely road," Tom muttered to himself. After a while, he noticed something strange. His GPS, which had been perfectly fine earlier, suddenly lost signal. The screen flickered, showing nothing but a blank map. Tom frowned. This wasn't normal, even out in the desert. He grabbed his phone to check for service. No bars. "Figures," he said, shaking his head. An hour passed and Tom hadn't seen a single other vehicle. That's when the first weird thing happened. He spotted something on the side of the road, a man standing there. The figure waved at him, trying to flag him down. Tom slowed the truck. The man looked strange, wearing old-fashioned clothes, like he'd stepped out of a black and white movie. His face was pale, and his eyes looked wrong. They were too dark, like empty sockets. "Help me," the man called, his voice low and raspy. Tom rolled down his window just an inch. "What's wrong?" he asked. The man's face twisted into a grin. "You'll find out soon enough." Tom hit the gas and sped away, his heart pounding. In his rearview mirror, he saw the man standing in the same spot, waving, but now his arm bent at an impossible angle. Tom told himself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by his taillights. But deep down, he didn't believe it. A few miles later, things got worse. Tom began hearing strange noises inside his cab, a tapping on the windows, faint whispers from the empty passenger seat. He turned on the radio, hoping to drown it out, but all he got was static. The whispers grew louder, merging into voices. "Turn around," they said. "You don't belong here." Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. "It's just my imagination," he whispered to himself. But then, something touched his shoulder. He jerked around, nearly swerving the truck off the road. There was nothing there, just the empty seat and the faint smell of something rotten. By midnight, Tom's nerves were shot. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, and he couldn't remember seeing any exit signs or mile markers. It was as if the road itself had no end. He thought about turning back, but the idea of stopping the truck and turning it around filled him with dread. Then he saw the headlights. Finally, another vehicle. A pair of bright lights appeared in his side mirror, slowly gaining on him. He couldn't make out the car's shape. It looked too big to be a car, too small to be a truck. Whatever it was, it didn't pass him. It stayed behind him, keeping its distance. Tom waved for it to overtake him, but it didn't. He slowed down. So did the headlights. He sped up. They did too. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice trembling. Suddenly the lights vanished. Not faded, not turned off, just gone as if they were never there. Around 2 a.m., Tom's fuel gauge started dropping faster than normal. He knew he had enough gas to make it through the night, but now the needle was hovering near empty. He cursed under his breath. Up ahead, he spotted a flickering light, a gas station. Relief washed over him as he pulled in. The place was old and run down, the sign creaking in the wind. But he didn't care. He needed fuel. The station seemed deserted. No cars, no attendants. Tom climbed out of the cab and approached the pump. The air felt heavy, and the faint smell of decay made him gag. He inserted his card and tried to pump gas, but nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. That's when he noticed something chilling. Inside the gas station, through the dirty glass window, someone was watching him. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, just stared. Tom took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But when he turned toward his truck, he froze. The man from earlier, the one he'd seen on the side of the road, was standing next to it, grinning. "Out of gas already?" the man said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Tom didn't reply. He bolted for the truck, jumped inside, and locked the doors. The man didn't chase him. He just stood there, watching, as Tom started the engine and sped off. The last hours before dawn were a blur. Tom's head ached, his eyes burned, and his mind raced. The road didn't feel real anymore. It twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. Sometimes he thought he was driving in circles, passing the same cactus over and over. Finally, as the first light of morning crept over the horizon, he saw a sign. "Welcome to Green Hollow." It was the name of the town he was delivering to. Relief washed over him. He'd made it, but something was wrong. The streets were empty. The buildings looked old, as if they'd been abandoned for decades. Even the air felt thick and oppressive. Tom parked his truck in the middle of the main road and climbed out. "Hello?" he called. No answer. As he walked down the street, he saw a figure in the distance, a woman in a long dress. Her back was turned to him. "Excuse me," he called out, running toward her. "I'm looking for—" The woman turned, and Tom stumbled back in horror. Her face was twisted, her eyes empty sockets, just like the man's. "You should have listened," she whispered. Before Tom could react, the ground beneath him crumbled. He fell into darkness, his screams swallowed by the void. Tom's truck was found 2 weeks later, abandoned on a deserted stretch of Highway 77. The trailer was empty, the steel pipes missing. There was no sign of Tom, just a single handprint on the inside of the windshield, too large to be human. Some say he vanished into thin air. Others think the highway claimed him, just like it claimed others before him. But one thing is certain: if you drive Highway 77, you might see his truck's headlights in your rearview mirror. And if you do, don't stop. Weeks passed, but the mystery of Tom's disappearance only grew darker. Fellow truckers whispered his name over coffee at truck stops, shaking their heads at the grim reality of another driver lost on Highway 77. Some swore they had seen his truck parked along the highway, lights flickering, engine idling. Others claimed they heard his voice crackling through dead radio channels, calling out for help, repeating the same message: "Don't follow the light." One cold night, Bill, the trucker who had warned Tom about Highway 77, was tasked with delivering cargo along the same route. Bill was no stranger to the eerie tales, but he prided himself on being logical. "A road's a road," he muttered as he rolled out. Still, he carried a rosary around his neck and kept a silver cross tucked into his shirt just in case. He drove steadily for hours. The moon hung high, and a soft fog crept over the desert floor, winding through the cacti like ghostly fingers. Bill tried to focus on the road, but his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. For the first few hours, it was uneventful, but as he entered the heart of Highway 77, he saw it, headlights in his mirror. His throat tightened. The lights were unmistakably from a truck, and they were gaining fast. His hands gripped the wheel. "Not tonight," he muttered, stepping on the gas. The truck behind him matched his speed, sticking to him like a shadow. Its engine rumbled, a low, haunting growl that seemed to shake the very air around him. Bill shouted into his CB radio, hoping someone would hear. "Anybody out there? I've got a tail that won't quit." Static. The headlights drew closer until they flooded his cab with white light. Bill squinted, holding firm on the wheel. Then the radio crackled, and through the static came a voice. "Don't follow the light." Bill's stomach dropped. "Tom?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Before he could say another word, his truck jerked violently to the side. He struggled to control the wheel as the road seemed to twist and buckle beneath him. Ahead, the headlights of the mysterious truck swerved off the road and vanished into the desert. Bill found himself parked at the edge of Green Hollow, just like Tom had. He didn't remember pulling over. It was as though the truck had guided itself. The ghost town looked more decrepit than he'd ever imagined. Wooden buildings leaned at unnatural angles, their windows dark and soulless. The air felt oppressive, heavy with the scent of burning rubber and decay. He thought about turning back, but the lights of a diner flickered in the distance, beckoning him like a mirage in the desert. Against his better judgment, Bill walked toward it. The inside of the diner looked surprisingly clean, as if it had been frozen in time. A jukebox hummed in the corner, playing a song Bill didn't recognize. Behind the counter, a man wiped glasses with a dirty rag. He wore an old trucker's cap, the brim casting shadows over his face. "What can I get you?" the man asked without looking up. Bill hesitated. "You seen a trucker come through here? Name's Tom Davis." The man stopped wiping. Slowly, he raised his head. His eyes were empty sockets, black and endless. "You already know the answer," he said with a grin. Bill stumbled back, knocking over a stool as he rushed out of the diner. His heart pounded, and his breath came in gasps. The world around him seemed to shift. The sky darkened, the wind howled, and the ghost town of Green Hollow began to dissolve like mist in the morning. He ran back to his truck, threw the door open, and jumped inside. Without looking back, he floored the gas pedal. The truck roared to life, tearing down the road. But no matter how far he drove, the signs ahead never changed. "Welcome to Green Hollow." Each time the town looked different, once alive with smiling families, then in ruins again, and once glowing as if consumed by fire. The CB radio crackled to life once more. "You should have stayed away." Bill recognized Tom's voice, but it sounded distorted, broken. "Tom, where are you?" "There's no leaving, Bill. There's no road out." Days later, another trucker named Jess was hired to haul a similar load down Highway 77. She laughed off the stories as silly trucker myths, the kind that kept people entertained on long nights. About halfway into her journey, she spotted something odd on the side of the road, a rusted truck. The markings on the side said Davis Transport Company. She slowed to a stop, her curiosity getting the better of her. The truck was empty, its cab covered in dust and dried blood. Scribbled across the windshield in what looked like grease was a message: "Don't follow the light." Jess stared at the message for a long time before climbing back into her truck, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. As she drove away, her radio clicked on by itself. From the static emerged a faint voice, "See you soon." And then, just like before, the headlights appeared in her mirror.